This story follows a classic transmigration plot, the kind where a game developer suddenly finds himself reincarnated as the villain of the very game he created, with his own hands. But before diving into the madness, let's rewind a bit and get some background on both the game and the poor bastard, whose fate is about to take a very twisted turn. It's the middle of the night, and Kim Woojin is finally wrapping up a bug that's been haunting him for weeks. He just finished fine-tuning the game route of a side character, Deculein von Grahan-Yukline now. Deculein isn't just any NPC, he's an intermediate boss, a named villain, and of course, Woojin had to make sure that, no matter which path the player took, Deculeion's death was absolutely inevitable. After grinding his ass off to get everything perfect, he's about ready to call a night when his ex walks in. Now here's the fun part. Not only is she his ex, but she also happens to be the team leader of the development team. Their relationship had its moments, but over time, things fell apart. Woojin was a lazy-ass procrastinator, while she was a workaholic who lived and breathed ambition. Sure, she did push him to be a better person, but in the end, it wasn't enough. 6 months later, he found out she had moved on anyway. She casually strolls in, takes one look at Deculein on the screen, and drops an absolute bomb. Turns out, Deculeion's character design was based on Woojin himself. His traits, his skills, even his god-awful personality. Everything matched him to a T. Before he can even process that piece of information, she notices her new boyfriend waiting outside, and leaves without another word. Now it's almost 2 a.m., and Woojin is still obsessively testing Deculein, making sure every little detail is perfect. But he doesn't like this whole Deculein is supposed to be him thing, because let's be honest, Deculein is a total bastard. A so-called magical genius from childhood, put on a pedestal for his potential, but in reality, just another mediocre noble drowning in arrogance. His personality is so damn twisted that calling him human would be generous. In the game he's supposed to get stronger over time, but no matter what, he remains the one character everyone loves to hate. Feeling a little mischievous, Woojin decides to tweak Deculeion's personality a bit, add something unique, something special just for him. Since this villain is practically his in-game doppelganger, he throws in a new attribute, comprehension, and because he's already in the mood, he sneaks in a few of his personal favorites: wealth, Midas touch, sharp eyesight, and iron will. But after stuffing Deculein with all these overpowered perks, it hits him. Maybe he went a little overboard. He quickly moves to revert everything back to normal, because the last thing he needs is another game-breaking bug right before launch, and that's when he gets a text. The message tells him to look outside. Confused, Woojin glances out the window, only to see a massive hole in the sky. The next thing he knows, a lightning bolt comes crashing down toward him, and before he can even curse, he's no longer Kim Woojin. It's been a few days since he woke up inside the game, inside the body of Deculein, the very man doomed to die no matter what. As he's still grappling with this absolute nightmare, Declan's sister suddenly barges into his room. Annoyed as hell, she scolds him for slacking off, instead of handling his duties. As a distinguished professor, apparently he's been sulking over a woman, instead of doing his damn job. After dumping a pile of documents on his desk, she storms out, but not before warning him to get his act together, because she won't stand for him, dragging the family name straight through the mud. At first, Woojin thought this was just some messed up dream, but as the days passed, the overwhelming realism of it all forced him to accept the brutal truth. He still doesn't know if this is some kind of afterlife, considering, well, he did get obliterated by a lightning strike. But one thing is clear, he's now literally the villain of the game he once developed. And if anyone needs a reminder, let's spell it out. Deculein is a mid-tier boss. No matter which route the player takes, he is the root of all problems, the ultimate enemy of everyone, and the reason countless characters suffer. And now, Woojin times him. Woojin had a lot on his mind, but one thing bothered him more than anything. He had no clue which part of the story he was currently in. The only thing he knew for sure was how much mana he had. But even that wasn't much help, since he had no idea how fast it would run out. He wasn't exaggerating when he said that. During development, he and the others had tested this game at least 1,000 times, and out of all those runs, this particular character, Deculein, had survived exactly once, because that's all Deculein was designed for. A middle boss. A glorified stepping stone, meant to die. Woojin's gaze drifted toward the documents that Deculein's half-sister had practically thrown at him, before storming out. Reborn von Grahan-Yukline, the current head of House Yukline, a position Deculein himself should have held, if not for, well, whatever mess his past self had gotten into. And as if things weren't complicated enough, it seemed, Deculein and Uriel didn't share the usual warm sibling bond. Fantastic. On top of that, Deculein apparently had a fiancée, Julie. Given how Uriel spat out her name with such disdain, Woojin could already tell something nasty had gone down between them. He flipped through the documents and found something even times better, asterisk. The contract? It turned out, he was already signed up as Professor Deculein at the Imperial University. He was in charge of teaching basic magic and mana control, and just like that, his fate was sealed. It didn't matter that he had zero teaching experience. Skipping out wasn't an option. At the very least, it gave him an excuse to step outside and gather intel on his current situation. But before he could even process everything, a system notification blinked right in front of him. It listed his primary survival goal, become necessary to the game, and his first side quest, deliver a lecture at the university. If completed, he'd earn 0.5 store currency. Not much, but crucial for survival. He also recalled certain routes, where Deculein ended up dead, thanks to Uriel's actions. Yeah, avoiding that sounded like a very times good plan. With a sigh, he got up, ready to tackle this new mission. The only problem? He had no idea what he was supposed to lecture about. But then again, that wasn't an issue. He had the comprehension skill, the one attribute he had added, before being unceremoniously dropped into this world. As long as he had a bit of mana, he could understand literally, times anything. As he changed into something more formal, he couldn't help but notice how different this place was from his old life. Yet despite never having lived as Deculein before, everything felt disturbingly natural. The tailored clothes, the aristocratic air. It should have been suffocating, but instead, they brought an odd sense of comfort. It was all thanks to Deculein's built-in attributes: intimidation, dignity, and aesthetic sense. It was as if Deculein himself was helping him settle into this body. Woojin didn't even feel the urge to act. Out of character, the rigid formality he once found exhausting now felt effortless. But despite knowing this was all just part of the role, there was something unsettling about it. As he walked toward his first lecture, everything felt eerily normal, like he truly belonged here, like he was destined to be one of the noble elite, standing high above the common masses. A far cry from Kim Woojin, the nobody from South Korea. That guy was just an average-looking slacker, dumped by his ex and going nowhere in life. But now, as Deculein, he wanted to fully embrace this role. If he was stuck here, he might as well play the part of a proper aristocrat. He stepped into his times car, or rather, Deculein's car. Just the interior alone absolutely screamed luxury. A stark contrast to anything he'd ever experienced before. Speaking of nice cars, the thought reminded him of his ex's boyfriend, the rich bastard who loved flexing his ride. But before his mind could wander too far, he noticed someone sitting in the adjacent seat. A young boy who, upon realizing Deculein was there, immediately straightened up and greeted him nervously, before handing over a stack of documents. Woojin entertained the possibility that this kid might be his assistant or secretary. When he asked for confirmation, the boy looked completely caught off guard, as if Deculein had just said something absurd. Apparently, this kid had been working under Deculein for 3 years. Woojin sighed and flipped through the documents, half expecting to find detailed lecture material. Instead, what he got was essentially a script, a word-for-word breakdown of what he was supposed to say. Every single detail. Yeah, this checked out. There was no way in hell someone like Deculein would have actually prepared his own teaching material. The prideful bastard was too arrogant and too untalented for that. Realizing just how much effort this kid must have put into it, Woojin felt compelled to say something. A simple word of appreciation wouldn't kill him, right? So he did just that. The reaction was unexpected. The boy practically froze in shock, eyes wide like he'd just seen a ghost. Even the driver stiffened. It felt like his whole world had just been turned on its head. Deculein, it seemed, saying anything nice was absolutely unheard of. And then, Woojin felt it. A sharp, a sickening sensation hitting him like a punch to the gut. It was as if his entire body outright rejected this act of kindness. The sheer absurdity of it all made him pause. Was this body actually punishing him for complimenting someone? What kind of absolute bastard was Deculein? Thinking back, he'd felt this same, nauseating sensation when he'd left the manor earlier. It was almost as if Declan's consciousness was clawing at him, trying to take back control. After a short journey, they finally arrived at the Imperial University, a place teeming with life and buzzing with eager students. Now that he was here, his next task was simple: find the designated lecture hall, mentioned in the documents. Rodeo Hall. As soon as he reached the hall, it was clear the students were already settled in, their eyes filled with anticipation. Strangely enough, They actually seemed genuinely excited for this lecture. Rumors had spread that Professor Deculein was a true master of spell interpretation, a talent that had once earned him the title of child prodigy at an early age. And then, the moment arrived. Deculein finally made his grand entrance, commanding the room's full attention, with nothing but his powerful presence. He introduced himself in a steady, authoritative voice. Deculein von Grahan-Yukline, head professor of the university's magic tower. With the formalities out of the way, the lecture began. As expected, the female students were absolutely smitten by him. With his sharp features, regal aura, and the sheer confidence he exuded, it was no surprise they hung onto his every word. But among them sat one student, who held none of the admiration the others did. To her, Deculein wasn't a brilliant professor or even a noble mage. He was nothing but a filthy thief, the man responsible for her father's downfall. Nearly 3 years prior, her father, a dedicated scholar of spell interpretation, tragically took his own life. He had poured years into his research, only for his life's work to be stolen. Broken and lost, he plunged into despair, and ultimately, death became his only escape. The one who had stolen everything from him, the so-called genius of spell interpretation, was none other than Deculein himself. With her father gone, she lost everything. Their home, their land, everything that once belonged to her family, was stripped away, leaving her with nothing. But she refused to let it end there. She had made a vow to seek revenge, to tear down the very man who had stolen her father's life's work. To achieve that, she fought her way into the Empire's Royal University, where Deculein now stood as a professor. While the other students remained, blissfully unaware of the truth, she was determined to expose him. She would prove his so-called achievements were nothing but a stolen bluff. But taking him down wouldn't be easy. She had to be smart, meticulous, and so, for now, she waited. Meanwhile, Deculein continued his lecture, his voice steady and unwavering, as he introduced the fundamentals of magic. He explained the 3 major attributes and 9 types of magic. Attributes were the very source of magic, while elements formed the materials that made up all things. The 9 types included summoning, destruction, support, enchantment, manipulation, ductility, bewitchment, and harmony. As he spoke, something unexpected happened. Woojin, the man now inhabiting Deculein's body, realized that this whole teaching thing was far easier than he'd expected. It was his first time standing in front of a class, and he wasn't even familiar with magic theory. Yet, even though he was simply reading from a prepared script, everything made perfect sense to him. Not only that, but Deculein's natural authority had students hanging on to his every word. Even the usual elitist nonsense, things like maintaining strict eye contact and controlling the room's atmosphere, felt effortless, like second nature to him. Maybe, just maybe, this version of Deculein truly had the makings of a great teacher. The lecture continued, delving deeper into the very nature of mana. How mana functioned depended on where it was stored, in the body. Mages typically stored it in their heads, as this made spellcasting much easier. Knights, on the other hand, stored mana in their hearts, allowing them to channel it through their blood vessels. But then there was the inner core, a method that combined both internal and external mana, making it the most universally effective storage system. In short, talent mattered, but hard work was just as crucial. If someone lacked natural ability, their only choice was to pick a path and focus everything on it. Ironically, Woojin couldn't help but reflect on how unimpressive Deculeein's own mana capacity actually was. His current reserve sat at around 3,500. To put that into perspective, there are mages out there whose primary mana pools exceeded 30,000. It was almost laughable that he times was the one lecturing students on magic, when by all logic, he should be the one taking notes himself. With that, the lecture finally drew to a close. But there was one last line in the script he hesitated to say. He was certain that, if this were the old Deculein, he would have completely ignored it. The line read, "If there are any students who have questions, feel free to ask." For a moment, silence filled the room. The students seemed completely absorbed in the lecture, leaving no room for doubts or confusion. Even Deculein himself felt relieved. No questions meant no unnecessary trouble. But just as he let his guard down, a lone student rose to her feet, the very one who despised him more than anyone else. She clearly had something important on her mind. Just last night, an unusual, sinister spell had been discovered in the dormitories, a phenomenon suspected to be the devil's own handiwork. But before even considering her question, Deculein's cold gaze snapped directly onto her. He pointed out her blatant lack of basic etiquette. She hadn't even bothered to introduce herself before speaking. If she couldn't adhere to simple classroom manners, Then he saw absolutely no reason to acknowledge her question. Without another word, he simply turned to leave. It wasn't truly about etiquette though. He simply lacked the energy to deal with this right now. His comprehension skills alone, right now, were consuming an absurd amount of mana. And at this very moment, he was practically running on fumes. Out of the 3,375 mana he originally possessed, only 2,000 now remained. Just grasping the lecture script's complexities had already drained 1,300 mana from him, and now, she expected times him, to analyze a spell he'd never even seen before? Yeah, not a chance in hell. Meanwhile, the surrounding students snickered under their breath, thoroughly entertained by the unexpected spectacle before them. Watching her utterly make a fool of herself, they assumed she had merely been trying to gain the professor's attention, only for it to backfire spectacularly. The poor girl, stung by the humiliation caused by Professor Deculean's biting words, struggled desperately to maintain her composure. Even so, she absolutely refused to back down, still stubbornly holding on to the hope that he would give her a proper response. According to her, the magic tower itself was refusing to investigate the matter, brushing it off as nothing more than a baseless rumor. But if anyone could solve it, it was Professor Deculean. She was sure he could figure out precisely what kind of magic was used. Taking matters into her own hands, she defiantly cast a spell right then and there, demanding Deculean interpret it. With no choice but to respond, Deculean reluctantly examined the spell, and in an instant, it drained around 1,700 mana. She then revealed that several debutantes of the dormitory had been analyzing the same spell, yet despite their efforts, they had found absolutely no leads. This was why she had turned to him, hoping that at the very least, he would take a glance at it. Without the slightest hesitation, Deculean coldly declared that it was barrier magic. His sudden and unwavering response caught her completely off guard. He continued elaborating that it was a bewitchment type barrier spell, meaning that whoever cast it had the clear intention of trapping everyone inside the dormitory with her question answered. Deculean wasted no time in dismissing her, telling her not to persist any further, since the matter had already been resolved. As if rubbing salt in the wound, he calmly collected the reward currency he had been promised before moving on, leaving her standing there humiliated. The scene then shifted to the university's magic tower cafeteria, where that same girl was now stuffing her face, without the slightest regard for table manners. Her name was Ephraim, and the only reason she had questioned Deculean, in the first place, was to expose his so-called spell interpretation skills as a complete fraud. Yet, instead of proving him wrong, she had made a clown of herself, and the embarrassment was crushing. Even now she refused to believe that Deculean had actually known what he was talking about. In her mind he had simply said, the first thing that popped into his head, bewitchment magic was extremely difficult. After all, most spells required specific parameters, yet Deculean had carelessly labeled it as bewitchment magic, without mentioning a single parameter. That alone was enough for her to call bullshit. What she had shown him wasn't just some random spell. It was an exact replica of the unknown magic circle that had been drawn on the dormitory's front door. The previous night at first, everyone had been shocked by the sight of the unfamiliar spell, but it had quickly turned into research material. Right from the start, for these new students, Ephraim was convinced Deculean was full of hot air, spouting nonsense just to sound impressive. But then, one of her friends came tearing toward her, absolutely breathless with excitement. The magic circle on the dorm's front door had finally been deciphered, and just as Deculean had claimed, it really was a barrier spell. After their collective research, they had all reached the same conclusion, meaning Deculean had been right all along. Ephraim sat frozen in absolute disbelief. There was no way, she refused to accept, that it had actually been barrier magic. More than that, she couldn't stand the thought of acknowledging Deculean as a legitimate master of spell interpretation. Meanwhile, her friend, still caught up in admiration, rattled off endless praises for Professor Deculean, going on and on about his incredible capabilities. Eventually, after singing his praises long enough, her friend decided to leave, but not before thanking Ephraim for having the guts to question the professor in the first place, since no one else would have dared. Even so, Ephraim remained unconvinced. There was no way Deculean had actually given the correct answer. On purpose, it had not been a damn fluke. What pissed her off even more was the fact that, instead of exposing him as a fraud, she had only made him look even more confident. Now everyone was convinced that Deculean was a capable professor. Frustrated, she began flipping through a document detailing Deculean's achievements, determined to learn more about her so-called enemy. After all, there was an old saying, if you know the enemy and yourself, you will never be defeated. If she had to deal with that jackass every single day, Then fine, she would make sure to expose him so thoroughly that his reputation would be ruined beyond repair. The scene shifts to Deculein, still dreading the worst possible outcome, detailing the classroom's recent chaos. The instant his gaze fell upon that spell, his comprehension skill automatically kicked in. But a mere glance at the spell circle, with its tangled lines and intricate structure, had been utterly devastating. It drained every last bit of mana he possessed. What frustrated him most, however, was that, even after sacrificing all that mana, he still couldn't grasp what the spell was. Even with twice his current mana reserves, it wouldn't have made a difference. The principles behind it remained completely out of his grasp. For now, though, he was simply relieved that everything had worked out in his favor. But just as he continued walking, his path was suddenly blocked by a woman, clad in gleaming white knight armor. With white hair and light-colored eyes, she was a familiar sight. Deculein recognized her instantly, not just because he'd seen her countless times in this world, but because he had worked on this very game. She was Julie von Grahan, his supposed fiancée, and a named character, destined to become the pinnacle of knighthood. He hadn't expected to cross paths with her this early, but there was no avoiding it now. Without hesitation, he responded to her greeting casually, claiming that he was doing fine, but Julie wasn't convinced. Her expression hardened, as she questioned how he could possibly be fine, after breaking the promise they'd made a week ago. Of course, Woojin, now Deculein, had absolutely no clue what she was talking about, and since he had no intention of getting caught up in unnecessary drama this early, he decided to brush it off. With a composed demeanor, he attempted to walk past her, dismissing the supposed promise by saying he didn't recall making any such agreement. Julie, however, wasn't having it. She immediately stepped in front of him. Once again, she blocked his path. She absolutely wouldn't let him escape like last time. Noticing the sheer determination in her stance, Killian realized she wouldn't let him go. Without an answer, he tried again, insisting he'd forgotten everything. This time, he even blamed his recent fever. He even had the audacity to ask her to remind him exactly what promise she was talking about. At that moment, the story flashed back to 1 week ago. Julie had made a solemn vow to him. If he could only be truthful with himself, if he dropped his pretenses and arrogance, and admitted his faults to everyone, then she would stand by his side, no matter what. Even if the world crumbled. Back in the present, Julie was on the verge of tears. Doubt flickered in her eyes, as she wondered if she had placed her trust in the wrong person. With a pained, sulking expression, she finally stepped aside, allowing him to leave. Killian, however, didn't even spare her a second glance. He didn't ask what was wrong, didn't acknowledge her pain. He simply walked away. And that, of course, annoyed the hell out of Julie. Though she kept her frustration to herself, their engagement had never been about love. It was a union of pure convenience, carefully arranged to benefit both families. Killian, a talented mage, and Julie, a prodigious knight. Their marriage was meant to strengthen the influence of their noble bloodlines, the Yuklines and the Friedens, two powerful families, standing together. No one had objected to it, because, on paper, it was the perfect match. But reality was a different story. As time passed, it became agonizingly clear that Killian's so-called talent had never truly existed. He was not the prodigy the world had believed him to be. Perhaps he even refused to acknowledge it himself, but the truth was undeniable. He had deceived everyone, branding himself as a genius in spell analysis, and even managing to secure a position as a professor. But that illusion eventually shattered. Headlines spread like wildfire, claiming the youngest, top professor of the Magic Tower was on a steady decline ever since. Deculein had stopped making any notable achievements. Even so, the Yuklines and the Friedens had done everything in their power to keep the scandal quiet. Julie was certain neither household wanted to become the subject of gossip. They had no intention of letting their family's shame become public knowledge, but Julie couldn't just accept it. She had agreed to this marriage, despite lacking any love for Declan, but she refused to tolerate lies. They clashed with everything she stood for as a knight. What stung the most, however, was that Declan himself had promised to uphold her beliefs. He had agreed to remain a truthful person, and yet now, it seemed to her that it had all been just another load of bullshit. Before moving forward, let's take a moment to understand the significance of the Imperial University and the Magic Tower. The Imperial University is the most prestigious institution in the game, and among its various departments, the Magic Department reigns supreme. To put it into perspective, the Magic Department is like the Korean University Medical School, while the Magic Tower is comparable to the Korean National University Hospital, a place of cutting-edge research and top-tier professionals. Woojin takes in the grandeur of the place, his eyes scanning the vast, meticulously maintained campus. The garden, with its neatly trimmed hedges and elegant pathways, resembles something straight out of an American college campus. Every detail here was carefully designed, and he knows firsthand how much effort went into crafting this atmosphere. After all, he and his team had spent countless nights bringing this vibrant world to life. Yet, as much as he longs to immerse himself in all this beauty, there's one lingering regret. He wishes he were in someone else's body instead. And just as that thought crosses his mind, he senses something's amiss. Someone is following him. The instant he turns around to confront them, he collides headfirst into the person trailing him. Papers fly everywhere, scattering wildly like autumn leaves in the wind. The unfortunate victim of this crash is none other than his assistant, Alan, who was rushing with a massive stack of documents. For a brief second, Deculeion's instincts scream at him, making him think it might be an ambush. But as soon as he recognizes Alan, that tension fades. Later, back in his office, Alan finally presents the documents he had been hurrying to deliver. It's a sponsorship list for this year's new mages. Much like real-world research institutions, the Magic Tower relies on funding for magical development, and the professors here sponsor, promising new mages they deem worthy. As Deculeon flips through the profiles, one name immediately catches his attention. Unlike the others, this one gleams with a radiant golden light, a detail he quickly attributes to his unique ability. And the reason for this becomes obvious. Deculeon possesses an attribute called Wealthy Magnate, which grants him an uncanny intuition. For profitable ventures, the more information he receives, the sharper his business instincts become. Then there's Sharp Eyesight, another ability that allows him to visually perceive attributes, mana levels, and other key details. The combination of these two traits makes it painfully clear. Any name shining in this golden glow is a walking fortune just waiting to be seized. And among all the names on the list, one stands out the most, Ephraim Luna. The realization hits him like a slap to the face. Of all people, the one his abilities mark as the most promising candidate for prosperity is the very girl who's actively plotting his downfall. The irony is almost hilarious. Killian knows her well. She's one of the game's key players, and according to the developers, she holds a fierce grudge against him, and for good reason. Her father died because of him. But as he reads on, something else catches his attention. Unlike the others on the list, Ephraim has no sponsors. When he questions Alan about it, the answer is hardly a shock. Everyone's playing it safe. No one wants to risk angering Deculeon by supporting someone who might become his enemy. And yet, there's something about her that demands respect. Despite never having attended the academy and learning magic entirely through self-study, her talent is undeniable, her potential limitless. But it doesn't change the fact that she sees him as an enemy. Or rather, he's her enemy. After all, he's the reason her father is dead. Woojin already knows how this story is supposed to unfold. If events follow their original path, he'll die. Just like in the game, it's inevitable. His fate is to be killed, whether by sword, poison, assassination, or a well-timed explosion. The method may change, but the result remains the same. That's all thanks to another one of his wonderful attributes. Villain's Fate. An ability that guarantees the entire world despises him and wants him dead. The only upside? Anything that fails to kill him only makes him stronger. But he isn't interested in dying. Not in this world, not in this body. If he wants to survive, he needs to make choices that the original Deculeon never would have. Starting with this one. Without hesitation, he signs the sponsorship papers for Ephraim Luna, handing the documents back to Alan. He instructs him to submit them immediately. He also lists a few books he needs borrowed, resources that will help him strategize his next moves. Left alone in his office, Killian leans back, lost in thought. If there's one thing he knows for sure, money, it seems, will be his ultimate shield. Many of the deaths awaiting him could be avoided. With enough wealth, sponsoring a promising mage is a step in the right direction. But it wouldn't be enough. Countless enemies lurked, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. If he wanted to live, there was only one way out. He needed to amass enough wealth and power to crush anyone who stood in his way. As Woojin fixated on his goal of becoming stronger, he couldn't help but recall that Deculeon's talents were, at best, average. If he didn't find a way to improve, he was certain he wouldn't survive. The countless threats looming over him. Fortunately, there was one thing working in his favor: his attributes. Despite boasting about controlling all four elements, the truth was that Deculeon's potential lay specifically in earth and fire. When these two were combined with metal, they resulted in something truly unique. His attribute, Midas Touch. This ability consumed his mana, to unlock the hidden potential of a target. His proficiency in metal manipulation also allowed him to wield levitating blades, though in reality, these so-called chain control blades were nothing more than refined telekinesis. However, in this world, telekinesis was an enigma, barely understood and rarely practiced. Deculein knew that, if he could master basic manipulation magic, he could compensate for his lack of overwhelming raw power by controlling metal objects at will. But for that, he needed to start with the fundamentals. Without wasting time, he activated his comprehension skill, instantly absorbing all concepts and spells related to basic telekinesis from the book in front of him. Moments later, armed with this new knowledge, he focused on a nearby pen. A faint energy coursed through his body, and in an instant, the pen floated into the air. His mightiest touch attribute let him cast telekinesis with absolute ease. No incantations needed. Although what he'd just learned was merely the foundational stage, he could already sense its immense potential. The idea of mastering advanced telekinesis utterly thrilled him. There was no telling what he'd be capable of. Once he reached that level, the next challenge? Even more ambitious. Integrating a magic circle directly into his body. In this world, you see, magic circles grew stronger the larger they were. Deculein planned to push this concept to its absolute extreme by engraving them all over his entire body. But first things first, he needed to understand his body on a much deeper level. Using his comprehension skill, he focused not just on his brain, but on his heart, muscles, and even his inner core. Then, the engraving process finally began. The moment the magic circle started etching itself onto his body, a searing, excruciating pain erupted. It was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It felt as if every bone was shattering, every muscle being ripped apart from the inside out. But despite the agony, Deculein didn't waver. Not a single groan escaped his lips. He endured it all with the grace expected of a true noble. And yet, when the agonizing process finally ended, he was met with failure. His mana reserve was far too low, barely at 1 point. The magic circle had only managed to engrave itself onto his shoulder. At this agonizingly slow rate, it would take 2 weeks to cover his entire body. Even so, he wasn't discouraged. This was only the very beginning. A month passed after Deculein's seminar, and the long-awaited first day of lectures at the university's magic tower had finally arrived. In a remote training area, students gathered in eager anticipation, ready for their first lesson. A notice board nearby carried a simple message from the professor. Before the actual lessons could even begin, the students were expected to prove their abilities. In an environment already rich with elemental energy, to everyone's surprise, the professor just up and left them, forcing them to figure things out on their own. Murmurs of confusion rippled through the crowd, but the one most annoyed by this whole mess was, without a doubt, Ephraim herself. Irritated, she muttered curses under her breath, wondering why the heck their professor would abandon them like this. Just as she was venting her frustration, a girl deliberately brushed past her, bumping hard into her shoulder. Already on edge, Ephraim turned sharply, ready to snap at whoever had the nerve to provoke her. But the moment she saw the girl's face, her anger twisted into pure, unadulterated shock. Standing before her was Sylvia von Josephine Eleda. For a moment, their eyes locked, tension crackling in the air between them. But Sylvia, completely unfazed, simply walked past her as if Ephraim didn't even exist. As Ephraim focused on her task, her mind remained tangled in the earlier encounter. She was certain the girl she'd run into was from House Elady. A decade ago, the Elades, fearing Ephraim's growing potential, had surrounded her family's manor with troops, threatening them into submission. And yet, here was Sylvia, acting as if she had no idea who Ephraim was. It made no sense. Lost in thought, she didn't immediately notice the drastic shift in the atmosphere. The magic structure she'd been carefully constructing wavered, its form destabilizing. A crushing pressure suddenly filled the air, a suffocating force that made her skin crawl. It was as if her mana was being violently sucked away, drawn towards something utterly unnatural. Snapping her gaze toward the disturbance, she spotted Sylvia. The blonde had just conjured a massive structure, one so utterly enormous that it dwarfed Ephraim's creation 1,000-fold. Ephraim's irritation flared instantly. The sheer turbulence caused by Sylvia's magic had completely obliterated her own hard work. Fury bubbled inside her, but Sylvia, as always, remained completely unfazed, continuing her task as if Ephraim didn't even exist. That, more than anything, absolutely set her blood on fire. The sheer arrogance, the nerve, the audacity. Determined to force a reaction, Ephraim decided to truly poke the bear. She began throwing sharp jabs at Sylvia, belittling her strength anything to get under her skin. After all, they were rivals. Sylvia had spent years threatening her, trying to crush her spirit and force her to step away from magic just so she could surpass her. And now she was pretending not to even recognize her. Sylvia, still infuriatingly indifferent, finally responded. She claimed not to remember Ephraim at all, but admitted she had heard of a certain impudent, negligent noble who had died. The moment those words left her mouth, the world around Ephraim blurred. Her father? That was a direct insult to her father. Her vision tinted red as rage exploded inside her. Without a second thought, she leaped into the air, magic surging around her clenched fist. Sylvia was going to regret opening her damn mouth. With a furious lunge, she swung a devastating strike straight at her rival. Sylvia barely had time to react. A protective barrier flared to life just in time, her eyes betraying a flicker of doubt in her own ability to withstand the attack. Then came the collision. An earth-shattering boom erupted, as their forces clashed, sending violent gusts, ripping through the students around them. The sheer impact made them stumble, groaning as the shockwave rattled through their bodies. As the dust settled, Ephraim stood victorious, her left hand gripping Sylvia's head, her voice roaring with fury. How dare she insult her father? The sheer audacity made her sick, but as her rage boiled over, something in the distance caught her eye. A strange, mystical, dark light had begun to form, at the exact spot where their mana had collided. And then, the screaming started. The students panicked, as the space around them distorted. Warping unnaturally, Ephraim's breath hitched, trying to avoid the collision that had ruptured space itself, and now, it was devouring everything in its path. The panic escalated as a grim realization sank in. If that thing exploded, metal fragments would tear through them like deadly shrapnel. It would be a massacre. Gritting her teeth, Ephraim threw everything she had into containing the rampant magic, her body straining under the immense pressure. But then, silence. The crushing weight vanished in an instant. It was as if the void had simply stopped. Heart pounding, she forced her eyes open, only to see a towering figure standing right before them, clad in refined, noble attire, radiating an air of absolute, undeniable authority. It was their professor, Deculein. The mere sight of him was enough to freeze everyone instantly in place. But what truly left them speechless was what he had just times done. With effortless precision, Deculein had halted the flying fragments, using ice magic in the blink of an eye. And as if that weren't enough, he then displayed a masterful use of telekinesis, controlling the ice shards with mesmerizing elegance. The scene was absolutely breathtaking, a stunning reminder of the true beauty of magic. Even Ephraim, as skilled as she was, couldn't help but feel utterly captivated by the sheer brilliance of it all. With the crisis neutralized, Deculein finally spoke, his cold, commanding voice slicing through the stunned silence. His words marked the official end of the lecture, but as his piercing gaze turned to Sylvia and Ephraim, the atmosphere shifted once again. Without needing to elaborate, his meaning was clear. Everyone else was dismissed, except for the two major troublemakers, responsible for times disaster. As the students hurried away, casting glances of pity at her, Ephraim could only stand there, her stomach sinking. Her face said it all. Oh, shit. She was so screwed. As the scene shifts, the tension thickens inside the interrogation room. Deculein sat in silent anticipation, awaiting the other professor's arrival. There was Retlon from the Spirit Studies Department, and Relon from Support Studies. Seated beside him was none other than Adeline Sigilian, the university's formidable chairwoman. Once the professors settled in, their attention quickly shifted to the true subject of today's meeting, the so-called reckless student, who had dared to strike down a noble from the elite household, Ephraim. Standing at the center of it all, she was nothing more than a nameless nobody to them, the kind of student the university wouldn't hesitate to discard. The way they sized her up, measuring her worth by her lack of noble lineage, made it painfully clear how this meeting would unfold. Had it not been for Deculein's intervention, things could have escalated far worse. His actions had impressed the professors. He already knew how this disciplinary meeting would go. The daughter of an influential family would walk away as the victim, while the so-called fallen noble Ephraim, a mere commoner, would be labeled the villain. It was a script already written, one Deculein had no intention of letting play out so easily. There was something about Ephraim that drew his attention from the very start, scarlet energy leaking from her, as if she carried some kind of curse. To someone like him, someone who bore the fate of a villain, it was as clear as day. That energy was a sign of trouble, a mark that the world itself wanted her dead. And if he didn't do something to shift the outcome now, that same fate would only inch him closer to his own downfall. The official hearing began, with Relan being the first to lash out. His voice was sharp, as he reprimanded Ephraim for her reckless behavior, scolding her for endangering students, and engaging in senseless conflict. If not for Deculeon's interference, the situation could have spiraled out of control. Ephraim, though dejected, remained absolutely resolute. She flat-out refused to reveal her reasons. Her silence, however, screamed defiance. It was a blatant insult, straight to the professors presiding over the meeting. But honestly, her only goal was to keep her true motives deeply hidden, especially from the very man she planned to utterly crush. Sylvia's earlier taunts echoed mockingly in her mind, but she absolutely couldn't risk exposing her true objective, not in front of her target. Her refusal only stoked the fire, and Relan, unwilling to let it go, sneered as he sharply questioned if she harbored some kind of inferiority complex. He drilled into her, emphasizing the glaring gap between nobles and commoners, as if to cruelly twist the knife. Sylvia was then called to speak. Calm and composed, she expertly downplayed the entire situation, claiming full responsibility for accidentally destroying Ephraim's work and brushing the whole ordeal off as a simple misunderstanding. In an instant, she had masterfully painted herself as the innocent party, making Ephraim's actions seem even more utterly irrational. The professors wasted no time grilling Ephraim further, hurling accusations of anger issues directly at her. Relan took it a step further, outright suggesting her expulsion. There was no point, he declared, in keeping a student who lacked the composure to follow basic discipline. Alienated and utterly alone, Ephraim sat in stony silence. Not a single word of support came her way. To the professors, she was already unequivocally guilty. Every insult, every harsh reprimand, was aimed solely at her. And the worst part? She couldn't even fight back. With her father now gone, there was truly no one left in the world to stand by her side. She could only sit there, utterly helpless, as the crushing weight of their judgment bore down on her. In her profound frustration, her gaze shifted toward Deculein. Somewhere deep in her heart, she pinned a portion of the blame directly on him. Not that it changed anything, of course. At last, Adeline spoke, noting how the professors seemed to be in unanimous agreement. But before she could officially conclude the meeting, she turned to Deculeon to get his take on the situation. That's when everything took a wild, unexpected turn. Ephraim steeled herself, fully expecting him to deliver the final blow that would seal her fate. Expulsion seemed inevitable, but to her utter shock, Deculein completely turned the tables on Sylvia. His voice cut sharply through the room, as he pointed out that Sylvia wasn't entirely blameless in the incident. The statement alone stunned both students into shocked silence. Without a moment's hesitation, he pressed further, questioning why Sylvia, with all her so-called prestigious abilities, had done absolutely nothing to prevent the fight. Surely, someone from the esteemed Ilade household could have handled such a situation with absolute ease. So why did she let it escalate? Sylvia, caught completely off guard, lowered her head in utter shame. After a moment of tense hesitation, she confessed the shocking truth. She had deliberately refused to block Ephraim's attack, hoping the girl would land herself in serious trouble. The silver-haired noble looked like she was having a full-blown mental breakdown, unable to believe that Deculein, the very man she saw as her sworn enemy, had just fiercely defended Ephraim. It made no sense. Why would he go out of his way to protect her? Relan, unwilling to let the argument slide, fired back, stating that Sylvia was still the victim, regardless of her role. The blame still fell solely on Ephraim, but Deculein wasn't done yet. With his usual cold, unshaken demeanor, he countered that the real failure here was his own. If his lectures were so utterly unimportant that they could be conducted without his presence, then perhaps he should take full responsibility instead. That statement left Relan completely flustered, the old fart scrambling to come up with any rebuttal. Meanwhile, Ephraim sat there, struggling to process the sheer absurdity of the situation. Deculein had just steamrolled another professor, all to protect her. It was ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous, and yet, it was happening right in front of her eyes. Having heard enough, Adeline made her decision. To her, this was hardly a grave offense. It's natural for students to clash occasionally. It was completely normal at their age. And with that, she dismissed the meeting, declaring no punishment would be issued. Ephraim and Sylvia were free to go. As she walked out, Ephraim was swamped with confusion. She had mentally braced herself for expulsion. Knowing Deculein, this should have been her downfall. Yet here she was, walking away completely unscathed. None of it made any sense, not one damn bit. Once the meeting concluded, Relan couldn't help but applaud. Declan's sharp insight and keen analysis, impressed by how he dissected every situation, but our boy's attention was already elsewhere. His gaze swiftly shifted to Ephraim, who had called for him. Hesitation was clear in her eyes, but she finally mustered the resolve to ask the question. That had been burning in her mind. She'd been holding on to this question for a long time, wondering if he recognized the name, Luna. Did he even remember her father? The man Declan had dragged through living hell, who had suffered so much because of him, that he took his own life just to escape the pain? The weight of that memory pressed heavily on her chest. And yet, Declan, master of anticipation that he had expected this moment. He knew she'd eventually reach out to him. Ephraim, utterly determined to get her answer, she studied him closely. Would he twist the meeting's verdict, just to protect himself? Would he dodge the question entirely? Or, even worse, what if he didn't even remember mistreating her father? That thought alone made her stomach clench. If he had genuinely forgotten, that would make everything far more unbearable. But Declan's response utterly took her by surprise. Without even a hint of hesitation, he told her that dwelling on the past would only hinder her own growth, that she shouldn't burden herself with old wounds. And just like that, he simply turned and walked away, leaving Ephraim standing there, completely stunned. Yet, in that moment, something clicked. He had times to know about her father, because if he truly didn't, he wouldn't have gone out of his way to help her then. Was guilt finally gnawing at him? Or was this his clumsy attempt at making amends? She couldn't tell for sure. But if his help was merely pity, then fine, that would be enough for her. After all, at the very least, that scumbag professor hadn't completely wiped his sins from memory, and as long as that remained true, she could live with it. And with that, Ephraim's case finally reached its conclusion, resulting in an unexpected 2 points added to Deculeine's death prevention score.